Ray Dalio is here. He is the founder, chairman, and co-chief investment officer of Bridgewater Associates. He created the firm in 1975 out of his two-bedroom apartment. Today, it is the largest hedge fund in the world with assets of around $160 billion under management. Fortune magazine has called Bridgewater the fifth most important private company in the U.S. The firm's success is anchored in its unconventional culture, which emphasizes values such as radical transparency and radical truth. Dalio expands on those ideas and more in Principles, Life and Work. I'm pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, so tell me the motivating reason to put this together for you. Why did you want to write this?
To help others make decisions better, to help them be more successful. I was originally very reluctant to share some of these principles. They were internal.
Because you thought they had led you to enormous achievement in the investment world, and perhaps personally as well, and therefore you didn't want your competition.
I don't like public attention. I would rather have privacy. But when we were successful in anticipating the financial crisis, we received a lot of attention. And because we operated with such different principles, had a unique culture, it became somewhat distorted. So I put those principles that we had at the time out on in our website. And they were downloaded 3.5 million times, and I received a lot of thank you notes because it helped people a lot. And so I accumulated more, and now I'm at a stage in my life where I'm transitioning from what I'll call the second stage of my life to the third stage of my life. First stage of my life, or one's life, I think, is when one is dependent on others and learns. Second stage is when we're working and others are dependent on us. Third stage is when they all do well without me or without us. And so my objective is to try to help others be successful without me. So this is my year of transition from, I would say, from that stage, from the second stage to the third stage, and I want to put everything I had of value in that one book. And so it's a series of recipes, essentially, of when I encounter this or that, what I've used. I also hope that it'll encourage other people to write principles. I've been trying to get you to write your principles in each person, because I think if we can have, principled level thinking, when something comes along, what do we do about that? How do you handle that reality? And we're clear on our principles. I think that would be important. I think it's particularly important at this time.
Okay, I want to talk about your principles. Let me just do a little bit of biography, though. Born in Queens. Mm-hmm. Your father was a jazz musician. Yeah. Mother?
Stay-at-home mom.
Stayed-at-home mom. Went to LIU, mm-hmm. right? Long Island University.
That's right. Then
went on to Harvard Business School. Was a caddy and had made a little bit of money and invested successfully on a small scale. But it gave you some great desire I
got hooked on playing the game.
That's right. And the game was what, as you would describe?
The markets.
The markets.
Okay, yeah. And when I was 12, I was caddying, and the stock market was hot. And I took my little caddying money, and I figured I'd buy stocks. And the first company I bought was the only company I ever heard of that was selling for less than $5 a share, and I figured I could buy more shares, and if it went up, I'd make more money. Right. That was a dumb strategy, right? Yeah. But what happened is this company was about to go bankrupt, and somebody acquired it, and it tripled. And I got hooked on the markets. And that began to be something that was a game, and it changed my way of thinking completely. It changed my way of thinking because in order to be successful in the markets, you have to have an independent view that's different from the consensus, because the consensus is built into the price. So you have to have an independent view different from the consensus. And you're going to be wrong a lot. And that began to influence my way of thinking.
You were wrong in, what was it, 1982, thereabouts?
Yeah, super wrong.
You bet that the market was going to go down.
Yeah.
And the market started on a bull run.
One of the greatest ever.
So you bet against that great... And went broke?
And went broke, yeah. I anticipated, calculated that countries could not pay their debts back to American banks. And that happened. In August of 1982, Mexico defaulted, and a number of countries defaulted. And I thought that was going to cause an economic disaster. And that was the exact bottom in the stock market. And I got a lot of attention. I was on Wall Street Week and all of that, and I couldn't have been more wrong. And I had to let everybody go. These are people I had wonderful relationships. They were like my extended family. And I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to help pay my family bills. And it was one of the most painful mistakes that ever happened to me in my life. And it turned out to be one of the greatest things that happened in my life. And that was because I went from thinking, that I knew, to asking myself, how do I know I'm right? How do I know that point of view? It gave me the humility that I needed to balance with my audacity. And it really led to this idea meritocratic way of operating.
So you wanted to say to everybody who's working with you, because of the lesson of 82 is that let's test every idea we have. Let's make sure that we're right, and let's listen to some tough critics of our idea and let it prove its worth.
Well, it started with me.
In the world of challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have anybody at that time, and it started with me thinking, what could I do to be better? And in particular, I wanted to speak to the smartest people I could who disagreed with me, right, to try to find out what their perspective was. I wanted to know how to balance my risk, and I also wanted to take a look at history in a different way. But the most important thing that it gave me was that need to be among independent thinkers who disagree, and to get the most out of that disagreement to develop an idea meritocratic way. So to develop an idea meritocracy, by that I mean where the best ideas win out, that they're not just mine. Because I think one of the greatest tragedies of mankind, of each human, is holding on to opinions that are wrong, being so attached to them and not putting them out there and stress testing them. So by putting them out there and stress testing them, it was essential. So there are three things that we have to do in order to have an effective idea meritocracy, and this has been the key to our success. First, everybody's got to put their honest thoughts on their table, speak frankly. That's not easy. Most people won't do that, but that's what we do. Second, you have to use the art of thoughtful disagreement. Enjoy disagreement. Doesn't mean it's conflict. It's an exploration of different points of view so that better ideas can come than those that are just in one's head. And then the third thing you have to do is have a way of getting around disagreements if you still have remaining disagreements, how you get past those disagreements and move on and find that acceptable. And so we have what we call believability-weighted decision-making. In other words, in most decision-making, there's either the boss who makes a decision in a hierarchical way, or you have a democracy in which everyone has equal votes. Both of those are not the best. In other words, the boss making the decision, how do you know the boss is right? And then the equal votes, that's silly because not everybody's equally good. By being able to weigh each person's point of view based on their own
So
abilities.
you weigh it based on past performance?
Past performance, assessments of each other, tests, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so there are points. Literally, somebody has a certain amount of believability points on different expertise. It may be, is it an economic question? Is it a legal question? Is it requiring different attributes? Somebody might be a big picture thinker, but be lousy at details. Or somebody might be really perfect at details and, the opposite. And so when we think about that, our goal is idea meritocratic thinking. Because if you can make great collective decision making, and you can then write those decision-making criteria down in principles, and then we've converted those to algorithms that make computer decisions in parallel, that's been our formula for success.
So it's that's the formula, not you, not one individual, but the process.
That's right.
Is what has prevailed.
That's
the
right.
process.
That's right.
A bit more about the company, because when there's some people have come to you and you talk about this and basically said, you're a jerk and you don't know how much you're offending people and hurting people by your conduct.
Yeah, there was a time in, I think it was 1993, people, I'm working with a small group, and they told me that, which is great. And I said, I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't want to do that. But I want to speak frankly, and I want them to speak equally frankly with me. So I was in a dilemma. Could I be 100% straightforward with them, and was that going to work? Or would they not want me to do that? So that dilemma made me think, how am I going to deal with that situation? And then I realized that I should have conversations with them and ask, how do you want me to be with you? Do you want me to tell you what I think and hear from you what you're thinking? And can we work that through? Or should I keep that to myself? And should we have a culture in which those things are held behind the scenes, and which would mean a political culture, that kind of thing. And so that began a process in which we said we would write down how we should be with each other. So these these principles became to how to develop an idea meritocratic process through that radical transparency. Let me be clear. This is not for everybody. This is not for everybody. People encounter that one way or another some people wouldn't want it any other way, that radical straightforwardness, and some people love it. So we go through that process, and that was an example. And I think that's such a good example that I wouldn't have known that if people didn't speak up like that. And there's so many things in my life that I probably just would have been clueless to.
I'm going to come back to more of your life, but let me ask you this. In 1982, in 2007 and 8, when everybody else was losing money, you made money. You made it big time, and it gave you a huge reputation in the financial world, global financial world. Was it the process that you believe enabled you to make the right decisions and the right calls?
Yes.
Because whatever idea you had, you wanted it tested in every possible way.
Yes.
Without concern for feelings or emotions, just the meritocracy of the idea, the investment idea that was controlling where you placed your funds.
Because it was a kind of a crazy view. Yeah. Meaning it was, when I say crazy, what I mean is it was a view that nobody had. It was a bubble. And rather than a bubble, it looked like enormous prosperity, and I'm talking about a bust. And how do I know I'm right? I'm still not sure I'm right. And how do we have that independent thinking so that we could step aside from the crowd and make a bet that's opposite the crowd and know how to manage that successfully? So I need independent thinkers who are going to stress test each other.
Are they all within your firm, or are they way beyond your firm?
I'll go wherever the greatest, smartest disagreement is.
All right. Then there's the case of Greg Jensen.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Here you were at 60, late 60s, and you make a decision about a person who you work closely with is the right person for this next job.
Yep.
Correct?
Yep.
You made a mistake.
Yep.
So how did you use this perfect process and come to the wrong conclusion?
Well, that's the process, right? In other words, I think I explained how failure is such an important part of the process, of a learning process, right? I don't know what the right decision is. And the ability to, frankly, I think almost in any case that I haven't done something before, I think there's a high probability I'm not going to do it right. So when we started out, we said that this could be up to a 10-year plan, because I knew that I didn't know necessarily how to do that. And so we undertook that process, and we learned about different things, learned about mistakes that I made in terms of making the choice and putting so much on one person under those circumstances. In this particular case, it was a situation that, because the business had grown up under me, I was both an investor and running a business. And I gave something that was too big,
both management and investing.
Both management and investing.
Right.
And I gave something that's too big, even was getting too big for me with experience. I gave that to Greg, and then we went through that. And what we saw was, of course, there was disagreements as to what should be done and how to do it. And one of the great things that we saw is that because we had this idea meritocratic system that we believed in, that we could work ourselves through that, even though we might have those differences. If you don't have a system for getting past your disagreements, you're going to have trouble. Think about it like the presidential election. We have one somebody who wins the popular election. Another person wins the electoral college. Okay? If we didn't have rules that we respected about how to get past our disagreements, we'd have a civil war. But because there are procedures...
That's why when people talk about not respecting the rule of law, if you don't have rules and I'm not going to accept this result, then you have a real problem and a real breakdown.
That's right. And so
that's why rule of law is so important.
That's why rule of law is so important. And those rules, though, have to be perceived as being fair. In other words, everybody says that's fair. And so when we went
and you have to believe in what fact is and what truth is.
Well, but also knowing you may not know truth.
Right.
You may not know what's true.
Facts.
Okay. You try to find your facts, but different people even perceive the facts. The key is how do you work yourself through disagreement well by you believe the process is fair. And so this idea meritocratic process allowed us to get through it. In most companies, if you look at most companies under the same circumstances, they wouldn't have got through their argument because the individuals involved would probably have said, oh, that jerk and whatever, and they would have had it. But if you believe that even though you think it's right, that everyone around you thinks that that's wrong and you take a vote, you can get past the disagreements. That's a very big power of an idea meritocratic process.
But in this case, it was your decision and your decision alone.
No.
So there was a committee that decided?
That's right.
There was a committee that said, that's right. We've heard almost like a jury, guilty or not guilty?
Literally like a jury, okay? There were cases, there was a group of about 15 people, senior people. That's how it works. There was a group of about 15 senior people, senior management people, and a group that's we call Stakeholders Committee, which was like a board. And we all are a community together. And so we all got together and we heard the different positions. And then we went through that and we took a vote and we decided what should be done. And everybody thought it was fair.
So what was the end result?
That we would make a transition at the time to Greg working as a chief investment officer. He's a brilliant, fantastic chief investment officer, part of that process. And that the management responsibilities for a year would come back to me, and that we made that transition. Then I did that for a year. And then we went on to have David McCormick and Eileen Murray be co-CEOs. Right. Me step back into a chairman role. And then, of course, I'm doing the investment. I'll always do the investment part as
You'll
part of that.
You'll always do the investment part.
Well, it's my game. I love to play the game. I will, for the rest of my life, play the game. Now, in terms of making others people successful, I never want to be dependent on. In other words, I want to make the other people around me successful. So I'll do the game, but in a way where I'm making their success of paramount importance. In other words, to teach the man how to fish.
When people say this sounds like a cult, does it offend you?
It does. It's just a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
It's just a misunderstanding. It's
because
often a misunderstanding.
You've got cameras and microphones that are taking what everybody says, and so everything's on the record, and therefore there's no there's no avoiding what you have said because somewhere somebody has recorded it or taken a picture of it.
So just so everybody understands, that's so everybody can see everything, right?
So you speak from the same page.
You can't have an idea meritocracy. If I don't let you to see something, then you can't have an opinion on it. Those who control information are the people who are going to be in control. So in order to have an idea meritocracy, this isn't for spying on people or anything like this.
No.
This is for the notion that anybody could see it firsthand and then make opinions of it and judge it. If you don't, so let me, in one sentence, describe what this is about. It's to have an idea meritocracy in which the goals are equally to have meaningful work and meaningful relationships, to be excellent at work and excellent relationships, and to do that through radical truthfulness, can talk about anything, and radical transparency so you can see everything. That's the basis of our idea meritocracy, and it's worked.
And you also think that this is what could be applied to almost all the big questions of our time. If we use this kind of rigorous process, we would come to a much better understanding of all the complex issues, whether it's climate change or whatever it might be.
Of course, if we're stuck with
fighting terrorism or
whatever the issue is,
making decisions about investment.
The process is equally valid, right? In other words, let's put our thoughts on the table. Three things. Put our thoughts on the table. Know the art of thoughtful disagreement so that we can pull that together and get past those disagreements in an idea meritocratic way. Yes. And I think you can't have good relationships. It's a personal relationship thing, too. In other words, how are you going to work with each other? Can I be truthful?
Would this apply to marriages as well?
It applies to any relationship that you better establish what your principles are and how you're going to deal with each other. You don't have to follow an idea meritocratic way, but I believe in myself. There are two things I require from people in any relationship I have, and that is to be reasonable and to be considerate. And I will be very reasonable, and I will be very considerate. And so I know that we'll have to have that thoughtful disagreement and ways of getting past that thoughtful disagreement, regardless of our relationships, in a marriage, in any relationship that I have. That's a personal belief, and that's what served me well. I've been married happily for 40 years, and that's worked out.
Also, what has served you well is your curiosity. This whole sense of wanting to know things, wanting to learn as much as you can. And along the way, you have, and you have talked about this, you have had and shared the friendship of some extraordinary people. There's a man on the standing committee in China named Wang Shishang. He's been in charge of corruption. He's known to sort of the top level of Americans as one of the most influential people in China. He's one of the people that you admire the most because you think his mind is in total pursuit of understanding how everything is connected, a kind of theory of everything. Tell me more.
I admire him. I admire Lee Kuan Yew, as you know. I admire Paul Volcker. I admire many people because of the ability to go above things and to look down at the world as a reality machine and to just think, how does that reality machine work? And to recognize that everything happens over and over again. The same things happen over and over again. Everything.
History has patterns.
Yes. Everything is another one of those. And so when you start to think about how does reality work and what are the principles for dealing with reality, and that implies to everything. We could talk about principles for skiing, principles for parenting, and so on. And so he thinks of human nature. I mean, it's basically almost that there are a limited number of personality types. Maybe there's 20 personality types. I couldn't tell you the number. And there's a limited number of situations. And these things keep happening over and over again. And when you start to see the patterns or look for the patterns, it's almost like you can see the universal theory of reality. And he's striving to do that, and he looks at the world that way. It's intelligent. It's not emotionally carried away. He appreciates the beauty of reality, even though the harsh realities. So I admire him for that.
But I assume you're in constant pursuit of sort of a greater understanding, too, because the principles are continuum. And I just open it to one thing. Bad, worry about appearing good. Good, worry about achieving the goal. Bad, make your decisions on the basis of first-order consequences. Good, make your decisions on the basis of first, second, and third-order consequences. So this book is full of that, but you're constantly adding to principles. You started with 10, now you have 200.
Well, what happens is, as I learn something, I've gotten into the habit of taking the time and writing down what is my principle for dealing with that thing. And I'm constantly learning. By the way, it's the best habit. I recommend it for everybody. Whenever something's happening and you're making a decision, write down your criteria for making a decision. And when you do that, you can also communicate it to others, and you can refine it over time. And what's been magical for us is also we found that we can convert that into algorithms so that we can also have computers run in parallel, making those decisions with us. This is happening. This is the type of thing that is a key to success, to be able to think, what are my rules so that when another one of those comes along, I handle it well.
Are you saying that you're teaching machines how to make the kind of investment decisions that only human beings have been making at Bridgewater?
Oh, we've been doing this for 25 years.
But you also have a huge investment in artificial intelligence.
Yes. Well, yes, in algorithmic decision making, right? That's right, because it's a language. An algorithm is just like writing, but it specifies those criteria. If you think of the brain, as you know, the brain is 89 billion neurons. And so those are little computers.
It is an interesting slip of tongue from neurons to euros.
Right. People in my business might do that. But they're little computers.
Right.
And they are programmed literally that way. And then data comes in. And that's how we make decisions. And nowadays, we can take our criteria and we can specify those, and we can have computers make decisions in parallel with us. It's like using a GPS. That's what it's like.
So where does intuition, instinct, hunch play in all this?
Oh, it's critical. And it's also, by the way, what the computer can't do well. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's the subconscious. As you know, man, although it's only 200,000 years old, the brain is much older. And we came programmed with many of these things in our brain, intuition and those things. And they're in our subconscious. And so by opening up one's subconscious to one's consciousness, so they come up, creativity comes from not working hard at it. It comes from relaxation. It bubbles up from the subconscious.
That's why you believe in transcendental meditation.
Transcendental meditation has been invaluable to me because it helps to do that. But that intuition, that creativity, man is still unique at being able to do those things. So you let that bubble up, but you have to reconcile it with your logic. So when the subconscious creativity, intuition comes up and you replicate it with your logic, it's fabulous. But then you take what you learn and you just you do something with it. Our converting it into algorithms and realizing that has been invaluable because the computer can process a whole lot more information, a lot quicker, and a lot less emotionally, so it contributes. But you don't have to do that to have an idea meritocracy. I want to be clear. Anybody in any relationship can have an idea meritocracy.
Where is the global economy headed?
I want to put it in perspective to give everybody a framework. I did a 30-minute video that I know you saw on how the economic machine works.
The economic machine,
right? So there are, if I can make this clear, I think anybody can understand that. There are three main forces. There's productivity. In other words, we learn, we invent, our living standards rise. And then there are two big cycles around that. There's the short-term debt cycle, which we call the business cycle. That lasts for about 10 years, maybe.
8 to 10 years.
And then there's a long-term cycle, a long-term debt cycle, which this accumulates and you build up a lot of obligations for the future, and that's a burden on the future. Right now, productivity is rising, although it's much difficult to measure, but I won't get into that too much. Mm-hmm. We're in the part of the cycle which is that when the economy is not too hot and not too cold, and when inflation isn't too high and not too low. It's the worldwide, generally speaking. We're in that part of the cycle. It's a good part of the cycle, okay? But we have an enormous number of liabilities. They're not just in the form of debts, although there are a lot of debts. They're also in the form of pension obligations.
Aren't they debts?
They're a type of debt. Right. They're an obligation.
Right.
And then there's also the healthcare obligations. And we have a demographic that's changing. And so that's changing. And then as a backdrop, we have really two different economies, okay? There's the economy, which I'll call for the bottom 60%. And then there's the top 40%. Or you can make it the top 20% and the bottom 80%. Two different economies, two different worlds. That disparity in wealth and circumstances is the greatest since the 1935 to 40 period. The top 1/10...
Which you think is the most interesting comparable period.
Which I think is the most interesting comparable period.
Correct?
Yes, that's right. The top 1/10 of 1% of the population has a net worth that is equal to the bottom 90% combined. If you look at the economy of the bottom 60%, just say, what does that economy look like? It's a miserable economy. It's a miserable set of circumstances. There's not been growth. Death rates are rising. Suicides, opiates, and so on. It is a miserable economy. And so we're in a period That is analogous to that period where there's a gap. So when we talk about the economy, we should really start to think about the two economies, and that we need to deal with that other economy. There's technology that is wonderful, but it is at the same time replacing people. And so when we deal with algorithmic decision making and we deal with that process, you can expect that that's going to increase the wealth gap, and it's going to increase that. And so the biggest economic, social, and political issue of our time is that split and how to deal with it.
Can our society survive if it doesn't do something about that split?
I believe that's right.
That is the question.
That's the question.
The book is called Principles by Ray Dalio. Bill Gates knows something about these ideas. Ray Dalio has provided me with invaluable guidance and insight that are now available to you in Principles, which is in fact the point here. The point here is Ray Dalio wants you to understand what he has discovered in life and share it with you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.